Number 6, the Book of Mark, 3rd quarter, 2024. Jon Paulien.
Our lesson 6 on the Book of Mark, it's entitled Inside Out. Dr. Jon Paulien is our moderator. Our opening prayer will be by Larry.
Dear gracious Lord, thank you so very much for this wonderful Sabbath opportunity to be together with friends, to discuss the great ideas of your love and salvation, and to ponder the mysteries and the riddles that you have posed in the Bible about how our responsibility rests in how we present what is on the inside of us. We ask that you will be with Dr. Paulien, and he leads in this evening's discussion. And thank you so much for your love. Amen.
Thank you for that prayer, because I think you touched very much the core of what this lesson is about. We'll be looking at Mark chapter 7 and the first half of chapter 8. And you can see that in number 1 of your handout. This section of Mark contains a number of stories that contain lessons about the meaning and practice of a life of faith. I have to tell you, as I studied out in preparation for this lesson, it was very uncomfortable. This is a very uncomfortable. Chapter 7 of Mark is a very uncomfortable chapter, particularly if you come from the Seventh-day Adventist tradition. It's a very uncomfortable chapter. And of course, one of the purpose of prophets and apostles was to disturb the comfortable, as well as to comfort the afflicted, but to afflict and disturb the comfortable. And Jesus definitely does that here. And I think what he does is uncomfortable today too, and disturbing today too, because it gets right down to the core. What is genuine religion? You know, we have a lot of talk as Christians, just in general. You know, we have a lot of things to talk about. Bible's big book. It's a complex book. A lot of things to talk about, you know. But when it comes down to it, what is genuine religion? What is faith? What does it mean to walk with God? Oops, here I'm asking questions. Okay, but that's how we get to the core of things, isn't it? And this chapter, wow, it just really gets down to the core of things. And let's plunge into it together. And the handout number 2 says Mark 7, 1 to 13, but why don't we just do 1 to 5 for starters? Mark 7 and verses 1 to 5.
Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?"
I'm looking forward to grandchildren coming in from Arizona in a week or so, 9.5 and 8 years old. I can see them reading this and coming up and saying, "Am I a disciple of Jesus?" And if your answer is yes, they say, well, that means I don't have to wash my hands before I eat. And I don't have to wash the dishes after I eat, because the disciples didn't do it. And I'm a disciple. Yeah. All right, so what is going on here? Why aren't the disciples doing these seemingly normal things? Anyone have a thought? Does this mean that children don't have to do the dishes or wash their hands? What's the real issue here? All right, Henry?
First of all, I would like to say that from our perspective, we may think that you just go to the faucet and open it up and wash your hands, right? This is a completely different reality. And there must be something different, deeper than what we think about washing hands, especially because the questioning is according to the tradition. So this is not just by hygiene practice. So we need to remember that. I remember working in the rural area in my country, and it was very interesting to go and have a meal with the Mayan people there. One little metal thing with water. It was very cold, so it was warm. And the doctor was the first one to wash the hands. And the same thing was passed around the table, and everybody was washing their hands with the same water. But the most important person present was the first one. If the pastor was going with me, he was first. Then I was second. So I think that we need to give more context in order to understand this and not take it as like with our culture that we could just go to the and open the faucet and wash our hands.
Excellent. Thank you. That gives us a good introduction to the issue. Anyone have something to add? All right. Daniel?
You have to realize that only in 19th century, Ignaz Semmelweis, the Hungarian medical doctor, discovered that if he forced the medical doctors to wash their hands, the mortality in the wards went down to 2%. And so if you read this post-Semmelweis, that's right. But you have to realize, no, this is a different world. So Mishnah says you take as much water as goes into half shell of an egg.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like good advice, does it?
So that's what we are talking about. Half a shell of an egg, and then you put it on your hands like this. And now I am clean from, I bought these vegetables from the Gentile in the market, but the Lord knows that deep down in my heart, I don't want to have anything to do with them. And this is the ritual, how I ascertain my exclusiveness in God's eyes. And imagine a few generations down from Exodus, that God will have a community who is there to bless everybody else, and you end up with this.
That's right. God called Israel for the sake of the Gentiles, but some of these rituals excluded the Gentiles, so they'd gone to the opposite, And this is what can happen, that religion evolves, and it rarely improves in the evolving. That's disturbing fact number one, right? Okay, I think Paul here and then Terry have some comments. And then I want to give you something I learned in reading these 5 verses that completely transformed my reading of this text.
I was excited to see Mark 7 on the agenda for tonight because it's really one of my favorite books of the Bible or chapters of the Gospels. And I think it's because of growing up Adventist, and you hit it. I think there's going to be a lot of discomfort here. But I think if we look at the Old Testament, we see so much of the message was stop apostatizing, stop going to idolatry. And then you have 400 years of silence. And then here comes the other thing. Well, the Greek philosophers would say you can fall in the ditch on the right side, and maybe you could say idolatry. But here comes the left side of the ditch, which you may go on to. So after Nehemiah and Ezra and everybody's finding religion, they don't trust themselves and they build rule after rule after rule after rule. And I think in Desire of Ages, Ellen White talks about how Jesus is growing up and these guys have kind of created a whole new message, but they're obeyers and they love their rules. And Adventists, this might hit a little close to home. And how do we defend the rules? How do we defend the rules? But I think embrace the discomfort. Let's go with Jesus here and see what he could show.
Well, we can't avoid it tonight, so let's carry on. Yes, Terry.
It occurred to me that I think it's very improbable that the Gentiles were not aware that the very pious Jews were going through this ritual to rid themselves of association with them. What on earth did that make them feel like?
Yes, that's right. And the very people who were to be the object of Israel's loving ministry were signaled to stay at a distance. Now, here's a crucial piece I did not know. I had assumed in reading this text that the word defile meant dirty, spiritually off limits, whatever. It's not. It's the word koinos. Like koinonia, fellowship, you've heard that one? Koinos simply means common. Koinonia means have a common, kindred spirits, fellowship. We're together with people who think like we do. Awesome, kind of like we have here at this time. But koinos means common, ordinary, every day. What's that doing here? Why koinos instead of one of the words for uncleanness, or something really obvious, right? Well, here's the deal as I came to understand it. It's not about hygiene. It's about being unspiritual, ordinary, common. It's about a ceremonial world that they created. This is the spiritual realm. If you eat with unwashed hands, you're common. You're out of that spiritual world. So there's like two worlds here, God's world and then the everyday world. And when you don't wash your hands, you're part of the everyday world. Now, where did that come from? Where did the ritual come from? It came from the sanctuary. It was God ordained. God gave them these things. Why did he give them these things? Why did he make the priests go through all those rituals? Why did he ask Ezekiel to lie on his side for 390 days? Why did God do stuff like that? And the best answer I can come up with is, he's a great teacher. And these will be unforgettable lessons about something much more important. So God gave them these kinds of rituals as part of the sanctuary. The lamb has to be perfect. Can't have a sore in the side, all the rest of that. So all these rules were given by God as a teaching device. What did the Pharisees do? They took those sanctuary rules and said, wouldn't it be better if we were all living like that? And so they applied the sanctuary rules to everybody. They took a teaching device and made it a religious duty. And that moved things into a totally different plane. So the question is, what's wrong with this? What's the problem? What they did was take something that God had ordained, but instead of a teaching device, made it into a religious duty. And now the religion became these things. And how does Jesus respond? Verses 6 to 7 and 8. 6, 7, and 8.
He said to them, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.
All right, so Jesus responds in two ways. He's got two issues with this. First of all, he said, it's out of the mouth rather than the heart. So you've made it a religion of words rather than a religion of heart. And we'll explore a little bit later what exactly that heart means. But it's surface religion, he says, just on the surface, just on your words, in your mouth. That's all it is. The second issue, verses 7 and 8, he says it's human rules rather than God's rules. Human attempts to follow God can undermine what God really wants. So they created a whole set of rules. Was it Henry that mentioned the idea of putting kind of a fence around by creating rules that separate you from the real one in the hopes that you never quite get there? But they can circumvent, these human rules can circumvent our attention to what God really wants. And I think the ultimate question we could ask is, what does God really want? And people give different answers to that question. And those differences are significant. So for Jesus, he has a double objection. One is it's surface religion. Anybody can dip their hands in the egg and sprinkle water. A heart commitment to God is a much more difficult thing, much more challenging thing. So you're circumventing the deepest kind of religion with something more on the surface. And the other thing is you're replacing what God has asked of you with what human beings have put as an expectation. So Jesus then says, let me make this clear with an illustration in verses 9 to 13. He gives us that illustration.
Then he said to them, You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. For Moses said, Honor your father and your mother, And whoever speaks evil of father or mother must surely die. But you say that if anyone tells father or mother, whatever support you might have had from me is Corban, that is an offering to God, then you no longer permit doing anything for a father or mother, thus making void the word of God through your tradition that you have handed on. And you do many things like this.
All right, so he points out a specific tradition, which ends up undermining the fifth commandment. That if you dedicate your entire fortune to the temple, you can use it for the rest of your life, but you cannot use it for the benefit of others. You got to preserve that treasure for the temple when you die, you see. But in practice, what it simply meant is now I'm free of any obligation to help anybody else. I can just enjoy this all for myself, which completely undermines the law that God had given. So a surface regulation gets in the way of a heart obedience to principles. So what is tradition? What do you understand by that word? Jesus doesn't seem too positive about tradition. What is it? And is it always bad? All right, Iris, what's wrong with tradition or what's right with it? Whichever way you want to go.
Well, when we look at how a child, for example, grows up, there are family traditions. There are certain ways in which we do life. And that gets passed on to the next generation by the lived example of the parents and active teaching of the parent, saying, this is what we do. You know, we pray before we eat, or we wash our hands before we eat. It saves the child from having to learn by trial and error, by doing things wrong, which is a very lengthy way of learning. It's a very effective way to learn by our own mistakes. But in some ways, in the best possible sense, traditions help us to learn to navigate life by the wisdom of those who have gone before.
All right, Daniel?
I think there are positive parts of tradition, like you're saying. But I think that sometimes traditions get out of date or maybe even inappropriate. And when other people look at them, for example, one's children or other parties look at it, they say, that's crazy. For example, I remember when I was young, we'd go to the beach and we couldn't go swimming in the water, but we could wade up to our ankles more or less. And when I went to college, skirts or dresses had to be X number of inches off. They couldn't get any higher than X number of things off. There were these traditions that probably maybe started out well, but when anyone looked at it, it discredited the whole idea of who God was and what God wanted from us. And it seems to me that's the problem with many traditions, is we forget about God and we're so busy keeping the traditions. And having grown up in Adventist, I look at some of these things and say, you know, we have in many ways given ammunition to anyone that looks at ourselves objectively and say, we're doing a lot of crazy stuff. And that we would do well to differentiate certain traditions, etc., from the core gospel and say, maybe the traditions were okay for a time and maybe they're still good, but they certainly aren't the gospel.
So you automate some aspects of your life in order that you don't have to make a decision every time you move. Wouldn't that be tough? You know, every time, let's see, do I move my hand to the right or to the left here? We can automate a lot of that, and family traditions can help with that. Yeah, when I was 19, I went to Germany for a year to go to school, and I discovered that the Germans had a very stupid tradition. Okay, you know, Americans know how to build a doorknob, right? You have a knob and you turn your wrist and all is well. And the Germans had these silly latch things, you know, and I thought, what's the matter with these people? Don't they know how to do a good doorknob? You see? And then one day I had 2 armloads of groceries and I came up to the door and thought, And I got my elbow over there, dropped the latch and walked right in. And I thought, maybe we're the stupid ones. You see, that's tradition. And tradition is automating certain things so that you don't have to make decisions about everything. In religion, tradition is the collective wisdom of those who went before you. The Adventist tradition is the collective wisdom of Joseph Bates and Ellen White and James White and all the rest of these as they wrestled with serious issues, you see. And there's a lot to be gained from that. But tradition is not always reliable. And over time, it can leave you in a place that's not constructive later on. So a bit of a tension there. Paul.
I think you raise a great point. A lot of times I hear people talk about this, and it's framed as Jesus was against tradition, but it's the tradition of the elders. It's a very specific tradition, right? Which was, Desire of Ages talks about it, it was corrupted. And we have an adversary, we have a great controversy viewpoint, and he's a deceiver. And one method that's used a lot is to subvert religious authority. So I don't take this to mean Jesus is against tradition. I mean, Moses is exhorting the people at the end, remember the Ten Commandments, remember these things, be faithful to that. That would entail traditions that are not corrupted. And so I think it's too broad to say Jesus is against tradition, especially in a progressive area. People love to rip down traditions. But I think you got to be careful. Like, whose traditions are you talking about? And even though it's hundreds of years old by the time Jesus gets there, it was not a proper tradition. The elders were out of bounds and didn't have the right to get so far out of bounds. And I think it's that Jesus is concerned with.
You can't always trust the elders. Yeah. All right. Ashley.
Well, and I just wanted to add, I think it gets messy when you start to confuse traditions with faith. And so if you're trying to judge someone from the outside by their actions, which are what traditions are, they are the actions, but that doesn't say anything about the inside. So I think that's where it's like the traditions help you, like you were saying, they're automated. So in some ways it serves as a protection or a guardrail maybe, but in that, yes, it's easier. So, as humans, we like things simpler, easier as we can be. So that is like a drive and temptation we have. But if we don't stay engaged in the meaning and the reason behind it, that's where we get ourselves in trouble too. So
yeah. Tradition is what we're used to. It's the way we do religion. It's the way we think. It's the context in which we operate. Yeah. All right. But here's the interesting thing. Tradition can sometimes seem as binding as the Ten Commandments. In fact, psychologists will tell us of a principle that a friend of mine calls life commandments. He says between the ages of 9 and 13, everyone tends to embrace certain truths about life, whether they draw it from their parents, their teachers, their neighbors, or their friends. But somewhere around 9 to 13, you fix certain ideas, and they become as binding as the Ten Commandments to you. Now, I'm going to be very vulnerable here so that you understand what I'm talking about. I discovered in counseling that one of my life commandments was always be on time. You might say, wow, wish everybody had that commandment, right? Okay. Yeah. But what I learned over time was the awful things that I did to people on my way to being on time. You follow me? That became so important that people became second. I've got to be on time. You're in my way? Out of my way. I'm going to be on time. Another one, in my case, was anti-dogmatism. I was somehow raised with a sense that people who have strong convictions can be very irritating. Not by choice, Do you recognize this one, huh? Okay. Not by choice. I wasn't thinking about it, but it was just somebody who just really has all the answers, just something inside just wells up. Now you know more about me than you wanted to. But these are realities. I don't know where they came from, but early on, this idea was so fixed in my mind that it was difficult for me to listen to anybody carefully and compassionately if they had really strong opinions on the subject already. You see? And that was counterproductive to me as a scholar. So I had to unlearn at least part of these commandments. They were both had their value, but I had to unlearn to some degree in order to function well. So this tradition thing comes very close to home. And so I said it's very uncomfortable for me studying this lesson. Henry.
I just wanted to mention and add in what Paul was saying, that the problem was not the traditions on itself, but it was the elders' traditions. But that was not also only the problem. It's just you are holding on, retaining on. And I think that's probably the key element in there, because then, just like the rules, they become the rulers instead of the helpers, which is the purpose, right? And the teachings have a purpose. They're not supposed to be the dominators. And this is what Jesus is saying. You are not just having traditions. They are from the elders, but you are holding on to them. You are not giving any reasoning behind. And I think that you mentioned it, I was fixed on that idea. I was retaining that. And I think that's when we need to be working on a lot.
Yeah, it comes naturally to us. We don't question it. Life commandments, and yeah, go ahead.
A lot of times we hear the word tradition and we just think of kind of casual things like, this is the way we always put our Christmas tree up, or something that the family kind of agrees on and we laugh about it and we can let it go. But I think what you're talking about, what really makes sense is so many of these traditions, there's traditions that come in our life that become so emotional that we cannot recognize them as traditions that become such a key part of us. I think maybe prejudice is a tradition. And it's so deep, it takes on a life of its own that becomes extremely dangerous and harmful. And the concept of clean versus dirty, this concept of something is sacred versus secular, clean versus dirty, can get into a child's psyche, and they just have an antipathy towards something that they see as dirty. And I have a feeling from this passage, there's so much emotion going on under the surface here, that something like that is going on here. Because you hear that these guys suddenly come up to him and say, now, how come your disciples aren't doing like they're shocked? And Jesus' response is almost like, I'm shocked at you. And there's this huge emotion going on because they can't even recognize that this is tradition. This is such a key part of who they become. I think we're all, the things we have to worry about the most are the things we don't recognize as tradition.
Mm-hmm. Very well said. For the sake of time, let me just pass over a couple of things, but a question I was going to have us discuss a little bit. Are there some Adventist traditions or traditions in your local congregation that are not based on Scripture and yet are really, really fixed? And I'll just share a couple and then move on. One of them is communion once a quarter. It's not written in Scripture. Roman Catholics do it every day. There are many Christians who do it once a year, Easter. And Adventists chose to follow John Calvin and go sort of cut the middle between those two. But it's not a scriptural law. Worship at 11 a.m. Starting to break that rule in Southern California, I notice. But that's a pretty fixed rule in most of the world. Worship is at 11 a.m. on the day of worship. And I think sometimes the eating of certain foods can be elevated to religious importance. I remember School of Religion had a dinner, and it was hosted by a Thai restaurant. And I got in the middle of a spring roll and saw something white in the middle and thought this was tofu, but it crunched. And we said, what's this? Oh, it's shrimp. All right. I didn't feel great about that, but one of the members there got home, woke up at 2 a.m. and threw up solely because of the thought of having eaten some shrimp. You see? So sometimes these things, it's a health principle, I think most of us would say, to avoid these things as much as possible, but they are easily elevated to religious duties. And that's what Jesus seems to be addressing here. Mark 7:14-19. This is number 3 in your outline.
Then he called the crowd again and said to them, Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that, by going in, can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. When he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. He said to them, Then do you also fail to understand? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart but the stomach, and goes out into the sewer. Thus he declared all foods clean.
All right. Fascinating text. What's the meaning of defile? In verse 15, is Jesus doing away with distinctions like clean and unclean meats? What is he saying when he declares all foods clean? These are questions that immediately come to people who have a tradition of distinguishing between certain foods for the sake of health. Is that what Jesus is talking about here? It's interesting, declaring clean. Now, this is not the word common. This is the normal Greek word for clean, for cleansing, for purifying. It's a household term. Clean up your bed, your bedroom, It's a household term. He declares these foods clean. Means edible. Once again, this household term came to have spiritual extensions. Unclean spiritually. Outside the realm of God's approval is how they would be understood. And a Jew in Jesus' day would have a difficult time being a Jew without these traditions because they're very much part of who they are. But Jesus was asking some serious questions about these things. Is this about clean and unclean foods, or is it about something else? What do you think? Why does Jesus say this at this point? All foods are clean. Is he undermining Moses? What do you think? All right, Iris?
I think it's again the ceremonially clean, man-made laws that Jesus is referring to. I think Moses gave guidelines that came directly from God. I think they were put in place to give a guidepost on how to maintain health. And I think then man added to this as if we could make it better than God spelled it out. So, we spell out the details, and I think then beyond fact comes the next level and the next level. And then all of a sudden we have a society of people that are more evolved and superior and perfect in the sense of keeping ceremonial laws.
All right, Gary.
Well, I guess it part depends upon what you mean defiled. We lived in Alaska for 2 years, and there's a bay called Poison Bay because back 100 or 200 years before, sailors went into this bay and they ate the mussels that were there, and a significant number of them died because it was poison. Now, that may not have defiled them, but it killed them. So I don't think you could say that it didn't matter what outside happened to them when it entered them. So we must be talking about something different here.
Okay. You can be defiled by what you eat in a health sense, at least. And that's how Adventists understand these distinctions. All right, Ashley?
I'm just going to take a guess that when Jesus heard these comments by the rulers, the leaders, he knew that the question behind the question was something more about a salvation issue. And so if we're talking about that's how they're defining this cleanliness thing, then he's saying like, okay, well, if you're going to judge people based on what they eat, then this isn't like an issue. Like this isn't the important thing. You guys are focusing on the wrong thing. So like Gary was saying, as a dietitian, when people are saying, oh, this is healthy or it's bad for you or it's good for you, and these like labels, and well, it's not that clear. It's contextual. And so it's not always helpful to label things like that perspective. But so my guess is he was trying to, based on their goal in asking the question, trying to redefine things and maybe bring them back to the purpose.
Labeling is a shortcut, isn't it? You get things labeled and you don't have to think about it anymore. Okay, I'll do this in this situation, I'll do that in that situation. Life is simple, but life is not always so simple. But notice in verses 9 to 13, Jesus is contrasting the Pharisees with Moses. They took the rule of Moses and they undid it by adding a tradition. Would Jesus now turn around and do the same thing to Moses they had just done? I don't think so. The distinction between clean and unclean is a biblical distinction. Whether it applies today or not, of course, one can interpret and discuss, and exactly how do you read these things? How do the different animals fit into these categories, etc.? But it is a biblical distinction, just as the washing of hands was a biblical command. But it was a command for a purpose in a certain context. And they, by expanding it, undid the usefulness of the original teaching of God. So the issue here, from Jesus' perspective, is that it's not about clean and unclean foods. That's not what this issue is about. The issue was the idea of touch contamination. Touch contamination. If you touched a Gentile, you would be defiled. You would be out of the spiritual realm that God had called you in. And if a Gentile touched some food and you ate it, you were contaminated as well. That was the idea that they had. Imagine what it would be like today if you followed that rule. How many restaurants have only Jewish hands touching the food? Only Jewish waiters. It's almost unimaginable, right? So they had circumscribed a world into this narrow place where they could hardly have any contact with Gentiles whatsoever. So for Jesus here, the issue is not clean and unclean. It's this theology of touch contamination. And so Jesus says, the food that you ate that a Gentile touched, the hands that a Gentile touched, this doesn't matter. This is not an issue of right and wrong. This is not about the true aspects of faith. The key is not the stomach. The key is the heart. What goes in does not undo your spiritual life. It's what comes out that can undo your spiritual life. So Jesus is not talking about clean and unclean foods here, but he's talking about a way of thinking of contamination and how it was undermining the spiritual life of his people. Daniel, go ahead.
Contextually, if you look at end of chapter 6, Jesus comes to Gennesaret, the other side, and when he was there, in Greek it says he went to an unclean land, where he's met by a man with unclean spirit, and when the demoniac is healed, he says, I will follow you, and Jesus says to him, don't follow me, exactly the opposite what he does on the other side, on the home side. And here it says, and when they got out of the boat, the people immediately recognized him. Remember, these are the people who begged him to go away. And now it says, and they ran about the whole region and began to bring the sick people and their beds. And where he came, the villages, cities, and countryside, they laid their sick in the marketplace, implored him that he might touch them, even the fringe of his garment, and many touched them and were made well. Nothing about the disciples. This is the largest missionary success of Jesus, and you're quiet about the disciples. So Mark 7, Jesus says, time out for remedial teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And he explains, guys, what makes you unclean is not what you touch, it's about your heart. Because the disciples are not rejoicing about the mission success. They are horrified that these Gentiles are touching Jesus and Jesus is touching them. And so he needs to do some upgrading of the operating system. And you know what comes after the remedial teaching? There's going to be the test. And the Syrophoenician women is the test for the disciples.
So the absence of disciples in these stories tells you that they were not approving of some of the things Jesus was doing. And it's interesting, continuing the context, Jesus goes on to Tyre and Sidon with a woman, swings around through Gentile territory to another Gentile territory, and feeds 4,000. Why are there two stories, the 5,000 and the 4,000?
And because they failed the test, comes the feeding of the 4,000.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that meant that Jesus was not the least bit disturbed sharing food with Gentiles. So he did the same miracle he did for the Jews. He did it now in another context with another crowd. So, but this is Mark. Mark, presumably, as far as we know, is writing for Rome. He's writing for Peter. And Peter seems to be attempting to bring out the kind of things Paul brought out so painfully over so many years. Now at the end of his life, Peter and Mark together beginning to realize the depth of what Jesus was actually saying. It didn't come overnight for them. It was challenging for them too. Yeah. The distinction between the spiritual world and the ordinary world for at least some Jews in Jesus' day was whether you did the prescribed washings at the right times, in the right way, etc. That was the distinction. For Jesus, the distinction between the spiritual world and the common world was in your heart, in your thoughts, in how you responded to the thoughts of your heart. Henry.
Can we bring this home and consider that traditionally for Adventism, being vegetarian or vegan is a badge of honor, right? If I am vegetarian, somebody comes and tells me, well, I am vegan. I'm even more sanctified than you.
And I eat only raw foods. So there.
We have all of those levels, and then we keep moving the tradition of the elders and hold to them. And now trying to save this parable, saying, okay, he's not talking about food, right? It's like we still have the possibility to use this parable in order to defend our position about foods. Is it time for us to try to move on as well and say, don't make it a test for others? All of them are welcome, because the problem is not what you eat, it's what you have on your heart.
That's how it gets uncomfortable, this text, very quickly. Yes. Thank you. Verses 20 to 23.
And he said, "It is what comes out of a person that defiles, for it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person."
Do you hear the echoes of Matthew as well, where Jesus says, "Thou shalt not kill, but I say to you, if you hate your brother, you have already transgressed the commandment itself." It's a matter of the heart. It's something deeper. What makes you common or unclean is what's going on in the heart. All right. Joan?
So I understand in theory that it's about what's in the heart, right? But what people do, their actions, also vice versa, show what's in the heart. So I don't know that discounting actions, discounting certain things is a 100% way to go, right? I think there's the part where it's, yes, your actions are saying, for example, that you're really, really pious, but in your heart, you don't really care about other human beings. That's a problem, right? However, if your actions are showing kindness to people, letting people be who they need to be, and while still saying, well, I may not agree with it, it may not be my decision, but it doesn't change that I love you as a person, right? My actions toward them would still reflect something about what's in my heart. So I think both matter. I don't think we can toss out actions because we say, well, it's what's in the heart that matters, because I think those actions will tell people what's in your heart. It's not enough to just be internal.
Can an atheist show kindness?
Absolutely.
And what does that say about their heart?
I would say they have kindness and love in their heart.
Can one do kindness for other motives than?
Of course.
Okay. Yeah. So we're not dealing with something wooden here. You know, automatically, if you feel like this, you're going to be like that, etc. A person can be deceptive. They can show kindness simply because it works in their social setting, etc. What's the distinction? How would you understand the distinction between head and heart? What's the difference between them?
I don't see a distinction. So I'm probably not the right person to ask the question. And the reason I don't is because I think those two things are connected, right? I think they influence each other. So I don't necessarily see that.
Would it be fair to say that they can be distinguished but should never be separated? Does that help?
Maybe.
Maybe. Okay. All right. Who's next?
So Jesus has just listed off all these bad things spewing out of the heart of each one of us. Maybe we don't have all of them, but everybody's sitting there listening, and if they're at all honest, they're saying, oh, he's caught me. And he knows more about me. I didn't want anybody else to know this. And what's the solution? I'm just looking at this, and I'm thinking, you mentioned touch thing, that concept is all over the place in these passages, and even going back to the Gadarenes, that they're basically saying, oh, I can clean myself from all this pollution, when he's saying, nope, sorry, it's too late. You're already messed up. It's all coming out of you. It's just pouring all over the place. And the solution isn't to say, or this is, I think, what I, as a sweet little Adventist, used to do, or still do probably sometimes, is, okay, I've got to stop thinking greedy thoughts, and I've got to stop being selfish, and I've got to stop, and I've got to be more kind, and I've got to change how I think, and I've got to change all this stuff coming out of me. And it's kind of like trying not to think of the red monkey in the room. You're going to think of the red monkey. And it's not something I can solve, nor could they. And I think Jesus' point and why he's so upset is because the answer, if you think of it from that touch perspective, is what the Gadarenes have already seen. Just let me touch your garment. Just let me be near you. Just let me be connected to you, because you're holy. I can't get there. There's no way I can solve this problem. And they can't see that. They're still trying to clean up.
You maybe didn't know this, but Ellen White was channeling you on page 409 of Desire of Ages, and I thought, might as well read it now. How often our service to Christ, our communion with one another, is marred by the secret desire to exalt self, longing for human approval. Zeal for God's glory is the motive implanted by his Holy Spirit. Only the power of God can banish self-seeking and hypocrisy. This change is the sign of his working. We cannot, on our own, be humble, be other-centered. We cannot, on our own, banish hypocrisy. It's natural to us. It's who we are. But the power of God, through the Spirit, can create a change that we are not capable of. And so the heart, I think what Jesus is saying about the heart is reflecting a person's commitment to God. Out of that commitment to God, the heart can be changed. Apart from that commitment to God, it cannot be changed. All the washing in the world, all the temple going in the world, all the worship services in the world aren't going to change anybody. It's the power of God through the Spirit. Comment here, yes.
I'm going back to the question you posed. I'd like to hear you restate that again about the head and the heart.
Yeah. What's the difference between those? Can you distinguish those without separating them?
Somehow or other, I've associated the heart being the emotional response and the head being the filter of that emotion and providing some refinement in that process. So you don't want thinking void of emotion. You don't want emotion void of rational thought. So it seems to me like that provides the integration of the two. You've just kind of made me think again, though, about this, because you've said the heart is really what God is after. And I'm not sure where I'm going to go with that now, because I wouldn't want to take that away, you know.
Maybe I'm not sure where I'm going to go with it either, but I think an illustration that was helpful to me as I was thinking about this, preparing for this, when I think of marriage, there are two aspects that are critical. One is a loving intention. No point marrying somebody if you don't intend to love them the rest of your life, all right? But that intention could change. You could have a really bad day, and it's like, I don't want to love this person anymore. The heart part, I think, is the commitment. I'm going to love this person whether I feel like it or not, whether I intend to be loving or not. I'm going to continue keep that covenant that I made, that commitment. And, as I think of Graham Maxwell's definition of perfection, was not so much in the outward deeds, but in that wholehearted intention, that wholehearted commitment to walk with God no matter what. And that is how I understand he was thinking, that we all need to become perfect in that sense of wholehearted commitment. And you can do that in a moment. You can just say to God, I'm sick of where I've been. I'm sick of what I've done. I'm sick of everything. Just take me, change me, mold me. 100% committed to that process. And that, I think, was what the crucial kind of perfection is all about, a perfection of commitment and intention together.
If I go back to my original thought about the heart being emotion, and I'm not sure that maybe the heart is where it is, the emotion. But an important element of that, I think, like you just reflected, is that emotions aren't necessarily trustworthy because they're influenced by so many different things. But there is some integration between our thinking and our emotion that brings us to a principle that says, I may not feel like loving you right now, but I know I do, and I intend to. So that seems like the integration somehow that brings...
I like the way you said that. I like it. Thank you. Bob.
Actually, I was thinking along the same lines. I was trying to think about God does tie in logic. For example, when Christ said, what do you profit if you gain the world and lose your own soul? At that point, God is talking almost an equation. I mean, balancing the scales, that's logic, not just pure emotion, because some people would say greed, people want vast fortunes, but God's saying it's really not worth it in the long run. So there, it seems to me, God is saying control your emotions, because there's a logical side, you can't take it with you. So it seems like there's a balance God wants, both kind of where Joan, I think, was going, it was sort of there's a connection. I don't want to speak for you, Joan, but it does sound like both have to be balanced, because Christ used logic in that sense. So control your emotions with God's logic. Is that fair?
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Let's go on to number 4. Read Mark 7:24-30. And think about, why does Jesus seemingly respond so harshly to this woman, in essence calling her a dog? Mark 7:24-30.
From there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone.
What did the woman say that changed the whole dynamic? Fascinating. A couple little pieces to this, and I'll move more quickly because our time is just about up. But there's 2 types of dogs in the biblical context. There's the wild, unloved, uncared for creatures that tend to move in packs outside the city. And then there's the cuddly little pets that people have in the house. So when Jesus used the term dog, he didn't use that ugly, nasty, out of the community word. He used a nice cuddly pet. Not right to take it from the children and give it to the pets. All right? And the other thing he said, feed the children first, implying that there is seconds for the dogs, the pets. She picked up on that. Disciples may have missed this. And by the way, Jesus is crafty. If he wants to get away from the crowds, he goes where the crowds won't go. Bunch of Gentiles. All right, the Jews are not going to follow him here. And so he goes intending to disappear and nobody knows he's there. Somehow Jesus could never be hidden. And so she found him. But she gets Jesus. In Mark, the disciples never do. So in Mark, this is part of a long trend. Jesus is excited because the woman gets him. She saw that his tone of voice or whatever it was wasn't the real deal. He was offering her a place at the table, the place that honored pets and loved pets have at the table, and promising a full dinner. But she takes it one step further. She says, even the dogs get crumbs from the children's table. If healing her daughter was a crumb, what kind of faith did she have about Jesus? She's saying, you can do anything. Healing my daughter is just a crumb. You're the whole loaf. You're the one who created this whole world, this whole universe. She saw something in Jesus the disciples hadn't yet figured out. So this is a very special story within the context of Mark. Feed the children first, but there's room when the children are done. Plenty of room for more pets. And Jesus sneaks in the Gentiles here just before going to a couple more Gentile encounters. Mark 7:31-37.
Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis. They brought him to a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private away from the crowd and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak.
So Mark describes a trip where Jesus goes north from Tyre and Sidon, which is north of Israel already, circles all the way around through Lebanon into Syria and down the other side, completely avoiding Galilee, and coming out on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, a place called Decapolis. And these are 10 Gentile cities. And he does this miracle privately. Now, for the doctors in the audience, I find his treatment curious. Stick your finger in their ear, spit, doesn't say where or who he spit on or what, he just spit. And then he touched his tongue and he sighed. Why did Jesus sigh? What does that have to do with all of this? Yes, Iris.
I don't know if I'm on the right track, but is it the despair that he may have felt when Adam and Eve first sinned, and when God knew all the destructiveness of the devil that would result from this? I mean, all the pain. There is ultimately an enemy who caused all of that. And for any person that he healed, there are many others who suffer in the same way or in a different variation of it. So in some ways, in such a miracle, even though he is restoring, but it is almost like the pain that he feels for his children to have gotten in such a state.
Almost reading my mind. Yeah. I can imagine Jesus. You remember back in chapter 4, seeing you do not see, hearing you do not understand. He can take this deaf and dumb man and heal him in an instant. What could he not do? Heal the hearts, heal the understanding. Because this sigh sounds to me like God's recognition of limitations within the cosmic conflict. You see, this man was an illustration of the spiritual condition of so many people who he could not do anything for. He could not do any miracle in Nazareth. because of their unbelief. So we see a God who accepted limitations, a God of weakness, who wanted to do so much more for his people, but he respected their freedom. He could open deaf ears, but he could not open unbelieving hearts. So once again, the heart becomes the centerpiece. We talked about the feeding of the 4,000, so we'll skip over number 6 and draw toward a conclusion. Verses 11 to 13 of chapter 8.
The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, asking him for a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, and getting into the boat again, he went across to the other side.
This reminds me of something Joan said earlier. A God who, in response to our question, walks away, doesn't answer, etc. And he sighs again. The part that jumped out to me here is that for Mark, not for Matthew, not for Luke, if you put the three side by side, story after story, Jesus is emotional in Mark. Matthew and Luke just cut it out. If they were working with Mark, they were clearly thinking these emotions doesn't put Jesus in a good light. Let me just skip that. Okay, it doesn't fit with my narrative here, you see. But in Mark, Jesus is emotional. For the Gentiles, the gods were impassive. They didn't have feelings. They were distant. But if Jesus is God in the human flesh, he's showing us that our God is very different from the pagan gods. A God who is near, a God who feels deeply, and Jesus feels deeply all the way through the Gospel of Mark. It's interesting. So it's clearly intentional on Mark's part. If you put them side by side, you can see bam, 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 emotions, sigh. Jesus doesn't sigh in Matthew and Luke. He sighs here in Mark. So Mark is seeing something in Jesus. While he has the least teaching, you learn from what Jesus does in Mark. And for Mark, this is a critical piece. David.
It struck me that Jesus sighed after many of these things, and it talks about God sighing on occasion. As much as God cares for us, it must make him really sad when we don't get the message. And Jesus went through 3.5 years in close contact, intimate teaching with these fellows, and it wasn't till after the cross that they even began to get a concept of what it was all about. That had to make him sad, and not just the 12 fellows, but the whole world. He's worked so hard to try and teach us on a level that we can understand, and we just flat don't get it. Some of it because it's just out of our range of thinking, but some of it, I'm convinced, is because we don't want to get it, because if we get it, then we're responsible for what we've learned, and we're going to have to change the way we are, and that makes him sad.
One thing that's impressed me through the years is to come to God with what I've called authentic prayer. An authentic prayer is saying, Lord, I want the truth about you and about me, no matter what it costs me. I think maybe until we get to that place, we may never quite have this full heart commitment. But a full heart commitment is just saying, you are so important, God. This relationship is so important. I don't care what I lose if I can have you. And it costs. The truth will cost you. It can cost you your reputation. It can cost you your job. It can cost you your family. It can cost you your life. But if you put any of those above the truth about God, you'll probably never quite get it. And that's a process. It isn't something that happens once. But whenever you realize that your ears are deafening a little to God's voice, your mind is listening less, to come back and just say, Lord, I realize I really need this truth, no matter what it costs me. And if you ask in that way, you will receive. You may also pay the cost. And that's, I think, the decision point that we often face. It's said nowhere more clearly in Mark than the next few verses. So, A+ comment, paving the way for what comes next in the text, verses 14 to 21 of chapter 8. And this is not in Matthew and Luke. All right, so this is Mark coming out pure and simple.
Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, Watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and of the yeast of Herod. They said to one another, It is because we have no bread. And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 7. Then he said to them, Do you not yet understand?
So after all this, the disciples still don't get it. And of course, now he's about to say, Who do you say that I am? And Peter says, You're Christ, the Son of the living God. But Peter demonstrates in the next moment he doesn't get it either. You see? So for Mark is telling his readers, if you struggle to understand who Jesus is, you're not alone. His family didn't get it. His religious leaders didn't get it. His pastor didn't get it. His disciples didn't get it. Yeah, his family didn't get it. His mother, in Mark at least, doesn't get it. Yeah. So when God seeks to truly reveal who he is, human beings have a hard time getting it. And maybe one thing I take from that is to be more patient with people today who don't get it. It can be frustrating to hear in church God portrayed in a way that doesn't speak well. It can be frustrating. It can be difficult to live with. It can be difficult to live with fellow church members who even see a clearer picture of God as something that's a threat or undermining their faith. That can be hard. But Jesus survived his disciples, and we can too, as we walk with him, with ears that are opened as far as we can and continually growing. It's my prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for Mark. Mark was probably the gospel that most of us saw as kind of a blank. It seemed to be just repeating what everybody else said. But in many subtle ways, Mark opens doors that might have remained shut without it. We thank you for that. And to the degree that we've been disturbed in the course of this lesson, I pray that your Spirit would use that disturbance to draw us even closer to you and even clearer in our understanding of you. We thank you for it all in Jesus' name. Amen.